Just say I'm going to the meeting.
We have so many council members who want to question everything, but it's never short.
I understand.
I guess you can't complain that they're not engaged.
That was not my complaint.
How are you?
We have gone by,
Okay,
and we're also recording the meeting, so we can proceed.
okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, we're gonna go ahead and call the meeting to order and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. Really excited about the items that we have on the agenda. So the first thing we need to do is approve the meeting minutes from the last meeting. Is there a motion to approve?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? You're saying, okay, so that motion passes. And at this point, I am going to turn the floor over for our presentation, Mr. Jasper, on the approval of goals, objectives, and performance measures. Jasper, sorry.
Thank you very much, and good evening. I'm actually, if it's okay with you, going to pass on the baton to Tom Harrington, the project manager from Cambridge Systematics, is in the room, who's going to take you through this agenda item.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone. Good evening. I'm Tom Harrington with Cambridge Systematics. I think my colleague Dahlia Levin's been in the last couple meetings, and so we're going to have some refreshers on some of the things we talked about before, and then there's some new material as well, and also an action item tonight. So we'll start with item 3, which is kind of reviewing goals, objectives, and performance measures that'll be used in the transaction update. We'll start with just kind of, again, going over the process we've been going through, really starting back early part of the summer. So kind of in June and July, we had some initial discussions with committees, including this group, about what we were doing with goals, objectives, and then kind of building to get to performance metrics. And we also conducted public engagement, which we're going to talk about some more tonight. In September, we were back with kind of some of the results we heard from public engagement, as well as feedback from the committees, and refined the goals, objectives, and measures. So tonight, we're actually putting forward recommended goals, objectives, and measures for action. They'll be taken to a recommendation. They'll be taken MBTA for action in November. In November, committees will discuss and recommend weights for the measures, and then those will go to MBTA in December for action. That's the overall process. Next, we've talked about goals and core values, and these are really critical to everything we're doing. So we wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the differences. So again, we have 3 goals, and these are what we want to achieve. So clearly, enhancing mobility, increasing accessibility, improve resiliency are what we want to achieve. We've also talked about core values, and those are how we want to achieve them. So we want to enhance mobility. How are we going to do that? By doing it equitably, sustainably, and safely. And so, goals are interconnected. We know that some strategies will help, that achieve mobility also help with accessibility and resiliency. So there's a lot of overlap, but I think that concept of goals being what we want to achieve and core values, how we achieve them, is one that we're going to talk about. The core values are associated with multiple goals also, and you'll see as we get a little further into this how they align with some of the measures that we're talking about. Also, as we talk about definitions in terms of objectives and measures, objectives are where we take those goals and break them down into more sort of measurable and targeted actions that result in incremental advancement toward the goal. The performance measures themselves are how we will evaluate the impacts of different policies and strategies and actions. And as we'll talk about, each measure can be weighted differently, which we will determine. And that'll affect the scoring of how projects are rated and how they're compared. So as we were developing a set of measures, some principles, they should incorporate all modes and project types, reflect the core values, be restricted. We have a smaller number, both it's easier to communicate, and then must be able to be measured and understood by the public. So those are just some general principles. on the measures. Okay. So on the sort of committee feedback, kind of go through some of the things we heard. First comment about adding a measure for analyzing non-motorized projects or aspects of projects to the mobility goal. So how we're handling that, or just in response, we do have measures under Objective A in terms of reducing congestion and delay. And so that accounts for, we'll be able to test bike and walk projects, and that will show up in terms of the impact on delay, as well as increase in transit use. I'm going to talk about these individually, and then we're going to look at a summary table. So I think that'll be helpful too. We can kind of go back and forth. So I'll go through these, and we'll look at all these together. There was a recommendation to move the emissions reduction from mobility to resiliency. And we heard that from a few groups, and that's something we have done. We've moved that between goals. It's still one of the objectives, but it's been moved. We also had a comment about adding bike accessibility to Objective C, improving access. And so that's a change that we've made to incorporate bike access as well as auto and transit access. Comment about making the emissions measure more explicitly related to emissions. I think in our earlier draft, we just described it as VMT, vehicle miles traveled. So the action there is it's sort of described as emissions, and it will be calculated. VMT is a key input to that, but it is for calculation of emissions as the measure. And then next comment was including the pedestrian bike modes in the safety measure. So no action needed. Safety improvements for all modes are included in the measure. We had sort of request to include network redundancy under the resiliency goal. We'll look at that a little more closely, have kind of updated under an existing objective, sort of how we're going to address that. That was some of the changes that are related to committee feedback. Other feedback from the committee, include a measure for supporting investment in the regional activity centers. No change there. The improvements in the activity centers will be considered in the objectives related to accessibility, but we're not specifically calling out the regional activities themselves. So benefits are there, but it's not a specific part of the measure. Adding access to other types of destinations. Right now, we're kind of focused on access to jobs. No change there. Again, with the data that we have, jobs serves as a good proxy for a variety of destinations. Jobs, shopping, at school, at other medical type locations. We can identify those with jobs, but again, it's representing access to those locations can be to multiple types of trip purposes. Changing the emissions objective to account for all emissions, not just transportation. No change there. Given the transaction of the transportation plan, we're focused on the transportation sector in terms of emissions. Last comment was consider including wait time in calculation of transit delay. And so no change there. Wait time is a part of transit travel. And since we're really focused on delay, not just total time, but delay, we're really looking at when transit vehicles are affected by congestion is the focus on that measure. Okay, so those were that was pretty quick, but that was the overall feedback. When we turn to slide 9, you can see the summary of how this all fits together. Again, it's the 3 goal areas, mobility, accessibility, resiliency. And then you see the objectives that sort of are aligned with the 3 goals. And then we also have 10 performance measures, and each of those line up with different objectives. The alignment with core values is also a feature we added to this table. So on the far right, we've got 3 icons for the equitable, sustainable, and safe in terms of how we're going to achieve it. And here we were just trying to indicate potentially alignment with the different measures, just to make sure that we're covering our core values. So we'll look at that as we go through the evaluation process. But here is kind of all the measures together. And I think you can see, I've noted, for example, moving emissions from mobility, it's now objective F, so it's in the resiliency one. So I think we'll stop here for discussion and questions.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Friedrich.
Thank you for that. A lot of work that's gone into it. I have a couple questions going back and forth between slide 6 and slide 9 on here. Because at the bottom of slide 6, the last two performance measures, it says the performance measures should be readily capable, robust, and consistent measurement and be relatively easy to communicate to and understood by the public. And when I look at the list of performance measures on page 9, some of the things that we're supposed to have a robust method of measuring are potential for safety and security improvements, that's E1, quality of access to transit, that's E1, and how do we vehicle emissions, like, so I have a question, how's my staff, how are we going to be able to robustly, consistently measure these things? Is there some method that exists that I don't know about that will help us measure potential and stuff like that?
And I should say that although we're looking for a recommendation on the objectives and measures, some of the methodology is something we're going to come back later in terms of some of the details. So I will say that. Yeah, in terms of also another point, some of these measures are purely quantitative. Some of them will likely be more qualitative in nature, such as D1, the quality of access which to transit and modes will be somewhat qualitative. And I think in the case of safety, it's also probably, we're looking at more quantitative versus qualitative for that one as well. So I think some of these, we're going to probably be back with some more details on methodology. Emissions, though, again, as mentioned, we use outputs from the travel model in terms of vehicle miles traveled and speed, sort of the key inputs to determining emissions levels.
So we're estimating rather than
yeah.
okay.
Right, because not every measure, like Tom was saying, is going to have quantifiable data like safety. We will assume that some improvements or the improvement would also mean safety improvement.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's something we really don't have a number for, like, oh, if you put in a new rail line, what does that mean for safety? And then what kind of safety? But we're just trying to say under the guise of safety, like if we did, and I think at the last meeting, we were talking about lighting and some of the features that go along with some of these improvements will lead to, you know, a safer facility.
Okay, so the be readily capable of robust and consistent measurement is only for some of the proposed goals, objectives, and measures, not all of them.
Well, again, there is an assumption that goes with this. You will have more, well, I guess industry standards tells us that you will have more people that will be more willing to take a facility if there's adequate lighting, you know, if there are features on the facility that yields a more safer environment compared to you have a trail or pathway that's not lit, unpaved, you know, looks like it's dangerous and things of that nature. Do we have a model for that? If that's the question, then Tom, we don't necessarily have a model for that.
Yeah, right. I mean, again, not everything will be quantified, but I think it's still a good goal that we want to, wherever possible, you know, is, you know, strive for robust and consistent. I think everything will be consistent. It's just that some things may be more qualitative and some things may be more quantitative.
Were there any other questions? Vice Mayor Bennett Martin?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Following up on Council Member Friedrich's comments, a couple of questions, comments. So the first, I guess, looking at comments on page slides 7 and 8, there was one that suggested making a performance measure more related to emissions, replacing performance measure with VMT. And then on page 8, sort of change emissions objectives to account for all emissions, not just transportation emissions. I understand the answer to that one, but I guess sort of tying these two together, it seems like we're not using straight VMT or using VMT at different levels of congestion. which wouldn't necessarily seem to take into account other transportation related emissions from vehicle manufacturing or roadway construction, maintenance, all of those factors. So.
Yeah, I mean, again, we'll be doing the best estimate we can with the tools we have, and again, think of consistency. Given the types of projects that we're looking at, we'll consistently look at them, but it will be driven again primarily by VMT and the speeds that the traffic are at. Recognizing particularly with air quality emissions, you can do very detailed and beyond that, but given the types of projects we're doing at a planning level, long-range planning, we think this will be a consistent approach.
And then,
I have more questions, but no, you didn't stop me. I just
okay.
more came up.
My other question, sorry, I've lost it. If you have follow-up questions, that okay.
So we can go back. So on slide 6 again, it says each region's measure will be weighted differently to be determined later to reflect the region's priorities. How are the region's priorities being identified? Is that the VDOT priorities and VTRAN, or is it WashCog, or is it
We're actually going to talk more about that in item 5, in terms of weighting and sort of, if what we're talking about here is how the measures will be weighted to reflect priorities. We're going to talk a little bit.
Yeah, but it's really the goals and objectives for this transportation plan, the transaction plan. Now, there's a lot of data that we have that's included from the COG data. We take their land use forecast and use that. But then if your question is it VTrans priorities or COG priorities? We have to set priorities for our long-range transportation plan, but because we work collaboratively, you will see some overlap with other, I was about to say regional, but for COG, you'll see some overlap with their plan. You'll see some overlap with VTrans as well.
So what you're saying is that we're setting our own priorities, or you are setting.
But they're probably
they'll be
very
weighted.
consistent.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Are you back?
Sure.
Well, did you have anything else that you?
Probably. Let's see, scalability. So a lot of these measures will be significantly different for large jurisdictions versus smaller jurisdictions. So is there some method of, looking at the final slide, which I know we're going to get to later, and I'll probably understand it better, but it looks like there's, I don't really understand if it's going to be consistent so that smaller localities will be able to utilize this funding source the way larger ones will.
So can I take this? So I will tell you, the smaller localities have not had a problem with their projects faring in the system. I know that's getting ahead to the 6-year funding program. We have, for example, the town of Hillsborough in Loudoun County population, and I'm probably overestimating the population. I think it's 122 people, but they received funding for their Route 9 project. So we can't have rolling measures for localities. All the projects are scored against each other, regardless of where the project is. But on the same token, I would say the smaller localities haven't fared poorly versus projects submitted by larger localities. And remember, we do have 2 qualitative considerations. When we get to the funding program, we always take into consideration geographic balance and modal distribution.
Okay. All right, well, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have anything?
No, now I'm done. Now.
Vice Mayor?
So at the bottom of slide 7, include a measure of network redundancy under the resiliency goal. And so I updated performance measure objective G to represent redundancy. What was that before? Currently it says transportation system redundancy. I have all questions, but I think that's right there.
Yeah, and so you can see that in the table, objective G. The table up there. Yeah, the maintain operations of the system during extreme conditions, which is one of the mandated objectives. That's the footnote is noting, and sort of the enabling legislation for the rating process. This one was called out, and so we're going to look into this a little more closely in terms of what that means for redundancy. But the intent, at least the original intent, was really about evacuation and event of, I mean, I think it was envisioning Homeland Security type of emergency. How do you move people, and are there options in terms of paths people can take? And so in the past transaction, that was done by sort of replicating an event where you had a much bigger peak period where you had to push a lot more traffic on the network. And so having options, parallel roadways, transit options, you know, helps you get better performance with that situation. So that's what it is. But I think also, as mentioned, we're gonna have more information, relook at some of the methodology to see if that can be tweaked.
Yeah, that was an HB 599 requirement that we had to look at emergency management, evacuation, which is interesting because depending on the types of emergency really would dictate the evacuation plan. So we tried to have something in here that gets to it because the law requires that we have something in here regarding emergency management, but it does put us in an interesting position if we don't know what sort of emergency that we're trying to manage regarding evacuation.
I guess my question or concern there is that it seems important to that to capture the benefit of expanding multimodal options to increase redundancy. And so if that can be incorporated into the performance, but like sort of come back to what Councilmember Friedrichs was saying about consistency and or the understanding of the public of what that means, you know, is it clear to do something like percent of population within a certain distance of a transit stop? I know that's sort of similar to access to jobs or mileage of new facilities in flood zones or something to get at the importance of expanding the multimodal options within that.
Yeah, I think yeah, under accessibility, both the accessibility and the D, the reducing dependence on driving alone by having options, both get at having choices, which again, this is where we get in, there's a lot of overlap on some of these. But it's important to note that at least for G1, it's aligned with that objective, which is sort of a mandated one.
Were there any other questions?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Get back to the bottom arrow on page 8 on the other feedback. So increases in transit ridership will increase total wait time, resulting in more delay. I don't understand. Is that, is that because transit gets full and you got to wait for the next bus, or because there's more transit vehicles on the road, or it seems counterintuitive?
Well, we were getting, this is getting into a little bit of like modeling and technical detail, meaning if we total up total wait time and we happen to have more people because we've improved the transit system with more people, and we just do a sum of the total, we're going to get more minutes. Simply, that was what we were getting at with that comment. So it's more just trying to come up with a measure where you're not penalized for having more riders. That's what we want to make sure.
Okay. All right. Good.
I just want to check in with those who have joined us online or on the phone to make sure that they don't have any questions or comments. Not to make sure you don't have any questions or comments, but to ask if you have any questions or comments.
Vice Chair has just one question.
Okay.
Has there been consideration for Western Loudoun County beyond Pittsburgh?
Consideration in what way? I don't understand.
Just consideration.
Well, we look at the county in its entirety. So the answer would be yes.
Okay. Absolutely.
This is for Monica. HB 599, does it specify which disasters are, or it just says disaster?
And emergency management, evacuation. Yeah, it is broad, and that's why we try to have something that addresses this, but it doesn't specify.
Okay. So at this time, we can actually move forward with action. That concludes the presentation. Is there a motion to recommend approval of the goals, objectives, and performance measures?
We'll move.
Okay. Okay. All those in favor? Okay.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay.
You know, I apologize for being late.
On the summary notes, my name's misspelled, so if somebody could, there's no E in Libby. That's not a big deal.
Okay, we'll take care of it.
I figured rather than have it repeat over and over. Thank you.
Okay, all right, so that passes, and thank you all. We will go ahead and move forward to item 4,
All right.
which is the online survey.
Yeah.
Mr. Harrington.
All right. Lots of me. So yeah, we'll talk a little bit about important survey that we conducted as part of transaction. This was to seek feedback that'll help inform transactions. So it was on travel behavior, transportation needs, and priorities were covered in the survey. The format, it was an online survey using a platform called MetroQuest, which allows for typical survey, but then also adding some gamification, as we call games, to have people make their set priorities. The survey was available in English, Korean, and Spanish, conducted August 6th to September 19th. As you see, we got over 2,300 responses, predominantly English, but we did get Korean and Spanish respondents. And as noted, we did some pop-up events to go out in the community. And so at some of those pop-up events, we had tablets to help folks fill out the survey. So we did get some Spanish speakers who received assistance. So those actually showed up in our English total, but were people, Spanish speakers. Important note as we look at results, survey was not a random sample recruitment. In other words, we just put the link out to the world and asked people to take the survey. Therefore, the sample does not statistically represent the population of the region. So as you'll see as we go through this, that's why we've tried to break things out by parts of the region to account for some of that geographical difference. And next slide, in terms of getting the word out, we had a whole variety of ways to do that. We had traceable links. So depending on where someone clicked on the link to take the survey, we could see kind of where they heard about the survey. The biggest one being from the website itself, but then from some of our outreach, social media and the pop-up events I just mentioned, newsletter, are ways that we got people to the survey. Next. So in this slide here about the survey respondents, you can look more closely at who filled out the survey. We did get some respondents from outside of the region altogether. We had a few DC zip codes, Maryland zip codes, and then also, Fredericksburg region, people south of the region that filled out. So that's why we're showing total responses, but then also as a percent of the Northern Virginia region responses. You can see that we had, of the Northern Virginia region responses, 43% from the core jurisdictions, Arlington, Alexandria, and Falls Church, 37% from Fairfax County, Fairfax City, and then 19% from the outer jurisdictions of Loudoun, Prince William, and Manassas. In terms of how those compare with the actual population, so we in effect did oversample in terms of the core jurisdictions. So Arlington, Alexandria, Falls Church, in terms of population, are more like 16%. So we received 43% of our responses from the area. Fairfax was also a little low, 37 versus 47% of the population. Manassas, Loudoun, Prince William, actual population is higher, closer to 37%. So that's why we're going to break up things by geography so you can see how those different areas responded. In terms of demographics, we had 12% from households with less than $50,000 a year in income. A little low in terms of matching sort of the regional number, which is closer to 17%. In terms of non-white or Hispanic Latino, 31% of the respondents identified that way versus numbers that are probably closer to 49% for the region. So again, a little lower there. We oversampled on people 65 years or older. We had 19% of the respondents in that category versus 11% of the population in that age range. So given that, we'll look at some total numbers, but then also how numbers broke out by geographic areas. So there's a series of questions about travel, and we asked about travel pre-pandemic, and then also expectations for how travel might change after the pandemic. And so, in terms of, we had certainly all modes represented, and so as shown here, like 31% of the survey respondents use transit at least 3 days a week. 14% had biked in the last 3 days, 28% had walked at least 3 days a week. So just to give you a feel for some of the types of people who responded to the survey. We asked questions about, do you anticipate changing your behavior, travel behavior after pandemic by mode? And roughly a third said they expected to change it, meaning either more use or less use. As you can see, some of the biggest changes were, I plan to reduce driving, 28% of people said that. 21% said we'll reduce transit use. Less so for bike and walking. Those are modes that people continue to see themselves using post-pandemic. So, and I should say with all this, I'm going to go through it very quickly, but there's these slides, as if you have questions, we can get into a little more detail and kind of dig out some of the numbers if you want to get into more detail. In terms of the next set of questions were around the factors that influence your choice about mode. So we asked folks, what sort of drives you to make a, or use the word drive, what influences what influences your mode choice? And so the top answers were trip distance, travel time reliability, traffic congestion, and access to frequent transit. So not too surprising. Those are really obviously travel related characters have a big determination on which mode you're going to take there. But certainly access to transit is a big one, because if you don't have access to it, you're not going to select it as a mode. The factors least likely to affect mode choice were actually safety related. So concerns about crashes and concerns about crime were actually pretty low on the list of people's decision to take a mode. We asked about incentives to use transit. In other words, what would help you, make a choice to take transit for a trip? So if it got them to their destination faster, if there was more transit near home or work, or more predictable travel time, those are things that would definitely make them consider using transit. And only 12% said they were not interested in trying transit. So I think there was, definitely openness to it, but it was based on some of the items listed above there. Okay. Also had some questions about emerging technologies, specifically electric vehicles and connected automated vehicles. For electric vehicles, survey respondents were more likely to consider using electric vehicles when there's more readily available infrastructure. And that could include charging out on the road if you take a trip and wanting to make sure there's charging available, but also charging at home, because in focus groups, we heard about people that live in apartment buildings saying, I'd like to, but I don't think I can have a charging station at my home. So that was, typical obstacle that was mentioned. And then also price. So once the price is similar or lower to the price of a gas-powered car, I'd consider an electric vehicle. And then for automated vehicles, that is where safety comes out as a key factor. So more likely to use an automated vehicle once I have confidence that they are safe. Okay, next. Then we had a series of questions around priorities. And these, as you'll note, aligned with our objectives that we just looked at in the table. Generally, we asked people sort of to rank, what would be your first, second, third, and fourth choice in terms of those priorities. From the group that responded to a survey, the number one priority was more transit, walking, and biking options. Second and third most commonly selected were reduced traffic congestion and improved travel time predictability. But in the next slide, we show how that differs by parts of the region. So in the core jurisdictions of Arlington and Alexandria, Falls Church, they clearly selected more transit, walking, and biking options as the top priority. That actually held up in Fairfax County as well. That was the top rated choice. In the outer jurisdictions, reduced traffic congestion was the top priority. But there's actually a little less variability when we go beyond that first choice. Actually, the second choice across the board was the travel time reliability. So whether you're on transit or you're driving, having a reliable trip was something very important to everyone. There. The next part of the survey was on a game where we would give people 10 hypothetical coins with $1 million, have them distribute between different project types. Where would you put the money as a way of setting priorities? So from the responses we got, our rail projects were the sort of received the most investment or coins, followed by roadway construction, and then bus projects in terms of the overall dollars. But again, if we look at the next slide, we can see that varied a bit by area, by the home location. So in the inner core jurisdictions, rail was first, bus second, and then roadway improvements third. In Fairfax County and Fairfax City, it was about even between roadway and rail, where they would put priorities, and then bus as third. The outer jurisdictions, roadway was top area, followed by rail, and then bus third. So kind of get a feel for how that varied a little bit by the area. And then just to kind of recap, so we heard top priorities, more transit, walking, biking options, reducing traffic congestion, and improving travel time predictability, but the order varied by geographic area. We're going to look at the focus groups in a minute. Those had typically cited the traffic and predictability, but we'll look at how sort of the makeup of the focus group relative to the survey. And then when allocating the hypothetical coins, roadway and rail were given highest allocation. People who do not drive frequently place the higher importance on non-roadway investments, so that's not surprising. But we did see that regular drivers did allocate, while they allocated the most resources to roadway improvements, they also allocated significant resources to rail and bus. So seeing that there's a benefit in having sort of the allocation spread different. Any quick, there was a lot of content, but any quick questions on those? End of that segment.
We'll start with Vice Chair Banks.
You passed the eye test. I just had a question. I remember this. Thank you for the presentation. I remember this survey. I thought there was a comment section that the respondents could provide just offhand open-ended comments. Did you guys tally that or consider it?
I think it's something we don't have summarized here, but I think that's a good point. That we'll be sure to pull out that information and see, because sometimes, there'll be things that aren't even on the list of choices here. Yeah.
Right, or even just to confirm the findings.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
And then Board Member Garvey.
Anything that particularly jumped out at you, struck you, surprised you, unexpected? Because it seems to me, going with the survey, it's kind of what nothing surprised me here in this.
Right.
Anything that struck you?
And
maybe it's in the comments.
Right. Yeah, I mean, in terms of how we'll use the survey, the priorities, as we're going to talk about the next item, are really important from the survey. You're right, some of the sort of general patterns about, highway versus transit are not surprising. I think the part that is very, uncertain right now is travel behavior, and we're seeing a very big change after the pandemic, or after this year, or whatever we're in it. So how long those changes will last. So that was really interesting to see what people are saying at this point. We also know, like, we've seen surveys come out even this year from 6 months ago. We're seeing change. So it's rapidly moving. This was a point in time on the pandemic, and it'll be interesting for us to look at that. But in the transaction, we are going to have some scenarios, and one of them is going to look at what we're calling new normal in terms of travel behavior. So I think some of the information we got here on that will help inform that scenario.
Yeah, I think we're going to be seeing different changes in work, how people go into work and all that kind of stuff, as we all know. And I don't think anybody knows, including people doing the survey, what it's going to be.
Yeah.
Councilor Frederick.
I love this, really interesting, especially the fact that rail seems to be the most important for everybody, but buses are really probably the best way of getting around this area. But anyway, on slide 14, you talked about how people would want to change their travel habits post-pandemic. And nobody seemed to, and maybe you saw this, but it wasn't that exciting, but did anyone say they were going to increase any way that their travel habits?
Yeah, the increases were smaller than the reductions, but yeah, we do have that information as well. That's kind of why it doesn't really add up to a third, but it turned out that if you look at everything, it was about a third that would change. Some of that was reductions, but some of that was increases. Yep.
And my other question is, you talked a lot about travel time reliability. That seems to be a really important measure. What about just travel time? Was that? Did I miss it, or-
Yeah, I think particularly when we're talking about what would the influencing incentives to use transit, get me to my destination faster would probably be more aligned with just total travel time. And there is a difference there, like in the incentive one, getting there faster and more predictable were definitely two choices that people made there.
All right, thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments? Okay, anybody online?
No, just Councilmember Milan has a comment. It's about that Western Loudoun County,
Okay.
the emergency and emergency preparedness. It's about how Highway 7 is a bottleneck whenever there is an accident or bad weather. Keep in mind, Mount Weather is located out this way for COOP operations, so some kind of emergency operation.
Okay. All right, so no other comments, questions? Okay, I do have a comment. I would also like to give you kudos. The public engagement, I think, was top notch. The targeting on social media was great, and I really appreciate the effort to be more inclusive. So good to see we're standing by our goals of equity and being more inclusive. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
So
And if I could, Madam Chair, to piggyback off what you said, I want to thank your staff because we reached out to your staff, your county managers, city managers and the like to help us get the word out on the surveys and the public engagement, and all of them responded positively. So thank you to your staffs as well.
Okay.
Madam Chair,
Yes, sir.
I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Harun and your team, that I saw you at the Manassas Park Railway Station. It was a wonderful day, but thank you for being there.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, everyone. Okay, so there are no more questions or comments. We'll move on to the next item on the agenda. And also, Mr. Harrison, I know it says Mr. Jasper, but Mr. Harrison, are you presenting this as well?
I think Mr. Jasper want to comment, but let's see. Yeah, second.
Yes, are we moving on to the final item? I don't think Tom's covered the focus groups, although something in my memory says we've already presented the focus group information to you anyway, so.
Yeah, so it's not there.
Yeah, okay. Well, if in that case, if we could go to the next item, which is kind of looking forward to the weightings for performance measures. This will be an action item at your next meeting. So we did want to initiate kind of an introduction to the approach that we'll be adopting on this, so that you're ready to go and to vote at the next meeting. Harun, if you just go down to the next slide. Thank you. So we have a number of committees like the PCAC that are engaged in this conversation with us as well. So we have the Technical Advisory Committee, which is the other of the two statutory committees that MPT has, and then we have one standing committee which is relevant to this conversation as well, which is the Planning and Programming Committee, and obviously the staff committee as well, the RJAC, has been engaged throughout. But what we'll be doing with the committees is asking them to, you as individual members to think about how you want to essentially weight the performance measures that you've just recommended to take to the authority at their November meeting, and assuming that the authority does ultimately approve the recommended goals, objectives, and measures, then we'll be coming back to each of the committees and saying, okay, now, how important are each of these measures relative to one another? We may try a bit of gamification with you on this one, not to sound or to trivialize the importance of this, but it's essentially you're going to have 100 points to allocate across the 10 measures, which is, if they are approved by the authority, will be the ones that go into transactions. So we'll be asking kind of each of you in a committee format to make your own personal decisions and then combine for the committee what you think is the appropriate allocation of the 100 points for the in aggregate for the committee, and then we'll do the same thing with the technical advisory committee and the planning and programming committee, and then we will kind of combine all three committees' results to get an aggregate set of weights, and we'll probably do some rounding as we did 5 years ago, so we don't end up with kind of ridiculous numbers like 1.75%. We find in this process that if we round to the nearest 5%, it doesn't actually at the end of the day affect the analysis very much, but it does greatly assist the communication of the weights to folks who are not as close to it as you all are. So that's what we'll be doing. And as Tom mentioned, and as you saw on slide 9 earlier, we've kind of aligned each of the 3 core values against each of the measures. So in a sense, when we add up the weights for each measure, we can also add up how that affects the importance of each of the core values as well, keeping in mind that core values, typically each of the 3 core values applies to about 6 of the 10 measures, not the same 6 necessarily, but so there's a real kind of multiplying effect when it comes to the core values based on how we add up the numbers for the individual measures. We'll be looking to this committee, as I said, to make your recommendations at your meeting in November, so that the authority can to take action on that at its meeting in December. And obviously, as the ultimate or really the only decision-making body, MBTA has a body has the complete discretion to change the recommendation to whatever the authority considers is the appropriate way to go forward. So, that just keep in mind the caveat that might happen, irrespective of what the recommendation is from staff, which will be based upon the individual recommendations from the committees. I would say when it comes to the point of casting your points across the measures, it's entirely acceptable to allocate 100 points to a single measure. Unlikely, probably, but it's also quite acceptable to allocate 0 points to a measure if that measure just doesn't kind of rise to the level that you think is important for the region. So there are no kind of preset rules as to how you do that, other than you can only cast 100 points. You can't cast 110 or 150 because the math won't work. That's the process that we're going to follow. And just wanted to double back to the survey results that Tom just mentioned. And if Haruni, if you could advance to the next slide. So on this slide, and it's a bit busy, you see in the left column the recommended option, the recommended objectives, A through G, that you just took action on. In the next column, you see a corresponding priority from the online survey. Now, they're not exactly aligned here because when we developed these categories in the second column, this was back in like May and June of this year, and the conversation with the committees has has obviously evolved since then to where we've ended up now. But there's still a broad alignment, certainly at the objective level, between what you've just recommended and where we started. And so in the following 4 columns, you see, firstly, for the region as a whole, how taking the results across the region ends up with a distribution of 100 points between those priorities. And perhaps equally important, if not more important, in the following 3 columns, you see how that breaks out by core jurisdictions. That would be Arlington, Alexandria, and Falls Church. Inner jurisdictions, which would be Fairfax County and the city of Fairfax. And then the outer jurisdictions, which would be the counties of Prince William and Loudoun and the cities of Manassas Park and Manassas. So in much the same way that Tom had highlighted some variations as you move through the subregions. When you look at, for example, recommended objective D, for which there are 2 corresponding priorities in the survey, but the one entitled More Transit, Walking, Biking Options, essentially based on the survey result, shows 20% of the total weighting will go to that objective, and the next highest being for the region being 17%, which is to reduce traffic congestion. That's recommended objective A, and so on. And then you can look to see, let's take that 20% number for objective D. It's slightly higher among core jurisdictions. It's about at the region average for inner jurisdictions, the Fairfax County and Fairfax City, and then lower again for the outer jurisdictions. And kind of conversely, if you look at that 17% for reduced congestion and delay, that's among the core jurisdictions, that's lower at 14%. For the inner jurisdictions, it's 18%, and then for the outer jurisdictions, it's 22%. So we wanted to break it out by sub-region, as Tom mentioned earlier, because when we looked at the zip codes, the home zip codes, we noticed straight away that there was kind of somewhat of a skewing in the way the people responded, and so that skewing is kind of rolled up and not obvious when you look at just the regional totals, but it does become a lot clearer when we break it out by sub-region. So, as I say, this is just for information. This is in no way intended to influence your voting, but it does give you a kind of a contextual data point as to how people across the region felt about this set of priorities, and the extent to which you want to take that into account next month is totally your discretion. There obviously are other factors which you have to consider in coming to a decision on polling. So this may be a starting point, but it isn't necessarily the end point. And in any case, that we don't have exact alignment between the recommended objectives and the corresponding priorities in the online survey. So we can't go like for like in any case, but I just wanted to set that context. Happy to answer any questions you have on the process, or Tom and I can answer any questions you have on slide 25. Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Back to you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Jackson. Are there any questions? Board Member Gardner?
Yeah, I think I've got different logic or something, or I'm not using good logic. Because improved access to jobs kind of came down fairly low for most people on what was important to them or objectives. But it seems to me if transit doesn't go where people need to go, which mostly is jobs, then it doesn't matter. Anyway, it seems like that's sort of the main thing, is to get people transit to where they need and want to go. And yet it ranked really low. Can you help me understand that?
Yeah, no, that's a fair observation, and certainly I'll let Tom weigh in as well. But what I would say is, when people responded to this question in the online survey, they were responding from the perspective of their own circumstances, as opposed to perhaps, you as elected officials would look at it would be for, the greater good of the region, shall we say. And so if someone is employed, and, I guess most people who took the survey, there probably was a high proportion of people who were employed, just because that's kind of like the regional average. They were probably employed at a place that worked for them based on where they lived. So they were able to get to work. And as such, their priorities were not necessarily about how whether I was able to get to my job or had access to my job. Would be more about my travel experience in getting to my job.
That's really helpful. Because the survey didn't talk to people who aren't on transit, it only talked to people who are on transit, right? Is that correct? Or did we got people who
No, it
are?
was a mixture.
Yeah, it was a mix. Okay.
It was a mix, yeah. It was a mix.
Yeah,
We-
well, thank you. I mean, that helps me understand a bit. From where I sit and what we're trying to do, to me, improving access to jobs ought to go much higher, much more to the top from our perspective. I think certainly fits with equity and certainly.
Exactly, and that's why I did say that you can take this as a starting point, but there are other factors that you must take into account based on your view of the region, as opposed to one person's view of their circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
We also, just to follow up on that, we also have improved multimodal connectivity is a priority that was originally added because I thought it was going to be an objective. In the focus groups, there was a lot of confusion about what multimodal connectivity meant. And we got a lot of people asking,
What's multimodal?
so in the end, that was not included as one of the recommended objectives. So I think one of the things is, well, where does multimodal connectivity align with the objectives we have? And it probably overlaps with a few of them, including improved access to jobs, and as shown here, including objective D. So that's just something to keep in mind as you look at the numbers, is we have one extra priority relative to the objectives.
Do we actually, right here, ship and then
And
we'll
actually, the comment I was gonna make, I think dovetails really nicely off of that, in that looking at the survey respondents, everyone overwhelmingly sort of is reducing dependence on driving alone and improving conditions for people accessing transit is highest across the board when you add those two objectives together. But when you match it to the performance measures, there's only, well, basically, there's other performance measures that deal with that, and so we need to take that into account when weighting accordingly, not just putting all of the points for that into D1. And then I guess, would it be possible to get a few sort of staff estimates for different types of projects, indicating sort of like, so it's hard to, I think, sort of understand how these, to do the weighting without understanding how would a BRT project versus a trail project versus a new road project sort of come out.
Are you asking for us to really run the model with these performance measures?
I guess.
That would be difficult.
Okay.
Only because that's an additional task for the consultant. What I will note is that for the current transaction, we have 15 performance measures. We knew we needed to scale down because we got to a point where some were canceling each other out. So I think with the 10 performance measures that you recommended authority approval tonight, which is great. I think the weighting, you're right, Vice Mayor, that's really going to be important. But unfortunately, that's a task order, an additional task order that we would have to undertake.
Okay. And then my last question, relates back to something we were talking about earlier, just understanding what the improved safety sort of means. And earlier you were talking about sort of lighting. Are there other examples of what that would include?
Project. Yeah, I mean, it could also include pedestrian safety, crosswalks. I think there's definitely infrastructure.
Signalization.
Yeah.
There's some signalization that helps with safety. even markers, you know, I think on the transit and roadway side, markers, appropriate markers on the road facility, appropriate lighting for transit and things of that nature. These are things that can actually be accomplished with projects without having, like, in one of our conversations with one of the committees, hey, what about security and paying someone? Now that we cannot do, but you know, things that go with the project like lighting and things like that, we can definitely undertake.
I just have a question from her, if that's okay, if you don't mind, if you could just real quick. Monica, can you explain where the 10 measures are, because I only see 7.
Can you explain it?
If we go back to page 9, where we have the complete set there. The column performance measures has 10 measures. So that's accept. So we have 3 goals, 7 objectives, 10 measures.
Okay. That's okay. I do.
Yeah.
Thank you. So sorry, thank you for.
That is confusing, so thank you for
We
that.
were both not sure.
Thank you. Councilman.
I also wanted to ask something that Ms. Bennett mentioned about safety is ADA compliance, one of the tools that we can put in
So-
as a safety measure, because it's safety for people
Right.
with disabilities.
Right, and when we get to, and that's more of a funding question, our standard project agreement requires that the projects adhere to all applicable standards. So whether that be ADA compliance, NEPA, whatever the standards are, the projects have to follow them.
And then my real question is, Mr. Jasper, thank you so much for explaining this in detail, because when I first saw this chart, my eyes glazed over, my brain stopped. But I do also wonder, we've been told that that these numbers come from a self-selected group of respondents, and then it's not scientifically valid. You know, in a higher level. I don't mean to say it's not worth doing, but it's very hard when they're right in front of you not to take them more seriously than. I mean, you specifically said we don't have to take them into account when we're doling out our 100 whatever, but it's hard not to take them into account when you're presented with such a nice, comprehensive and complicated and impressive table. You know, we see the 17% and the 5%, and we're thinking that's 17% and that's 5%, but it's really just the people who took the time to answer. And as you pointed out, some groups are overrepresented and some are underrepresented. So I hope that we'll take your advice and think about it when we're looking at this, and not give more power to those numbers than they deserve, and not ignore them either.
Yeah, it's a very good point, and I would encourage you in the time between this meeting and the next one, if you can find time, to look at the 10 measures that were on slide 9, and you know, individually with colleagues, with staff, whatever process works for you, and maybe take an initial cut at, you know, where you would allocate those 100 points. If you come into the meeting with that exercise already done in your own head for your circumstance, then what we can do at the meeting will be to quickly collate that information and kind of present it back to the committee, so you can kind of see from a group perspective where you are, and then, you know, compare and contrast and discuss and hopefully reach some consensus as to what makes sense for the region. So yeah, I mean, take that information, you know, at face value. By breaking it out by sub-region, you know, we feel that it kind of addresses some of the skewing that we saw when we initially looked at the raw information. But as Tom mentioned, you know, because it's a self-selected sample, we cannot claim it's statistically significant, because it was not done in a randomized, structured way as would be necessary to kind of be able to say that and give you a margin of error and so on. So you have to take it at face value, but even so, 2,300 responses, although that's probably only about 1% of the total population of Northern Virginia, it's still a reasonably good response to start from. But I wouldn't go any further than saying it's a starting point.
And Board Member Garvey, did you have a question as well?
No, I'm just mulling. I had one. Thank you for asking. It's occurred to me, and so does staff have an opinion, and do you not want to tell us? I'm guessing.
We're here to hear from you. Yeah, we at this point, because we've heard, from the citizens who responded to the survey yesterday, we had a meeting with stakeholders, we had the technical advisory committee meeting last week, meeting with you tonight. We're actually meeting with the full authority tomorrow, doing a work session with them on the performance measures before we ask for them to adopt it. So for staff purposes, we just really need to hear the feedback, because what we see as staff could be very different from what you see as elected officials and what you have to address. My top concern is ensuring compliance with the law that requires that we give priority, to the projects that have the greatest level of congestion reduction relative to cost. So congestion reduction inherently is always given a little higher weight, if you will, because we need to ensure we comply with the law.
Thank you. Yeah, staff's job often is to make sure we comply with the law.
And we do appreciate that.
So I'll just say, what I'm planning to do is go back and sit down with my staff and talk it through, because I have some ideas and thoughts, but I bet there's a bunch of stuff I'm not thinking about. So I do, so I'm going to do it. Maybe I see all the head nods around. I think we'll probably you'll get better responses out of us if we.
No, we appreciate that. That's why we didn't want your action on the performance measures and goals and objectives the same night as waiting on these, because this is a lot. It is a lot. And it's the region's long-range transportation plan, and it will shape funding cycles for the next couple of years until we do it again. So we appreciate the fact that you want to go back and take a look. To get back to what Ms. Bennett Parker said earlier, one thing we do ensure is that, and we'll do some, what's the word that I'm looking for that's escaping me, validation of the model to ensure that there's equity in how the projects are scored. We're using a different model for this process than we used for the last one. So when we get to the actual 6-year program and funding a project, before we get to that, during the whole evaluation, we make sure that we do a validation of the model as well. God bless you.
Thank you. Yeah. And I think that's great. I'm thinking I'm going to try to use our, we have these equity questions, which make you get, who benefits, who's burdened, who's missing. There's just like, so that'll kind of help too. Yeah, if we all come through it all our different ways,
Yeah, I think some people were surprised, like one program cycle or twice we funded the WO&D trail. And I did get a few comments. You funded the trail. Look, the project competed with every other project and it scored well. So we do take that into consideration. So when people say, oh, because sometimes people inherently have in their mind which projects should advance, but we're multimodal, understanding that there is no one-size-fits-all solution in this region, given just the very diverse nature of the region. But I know I got a few questions about the WO&D trail.
Moves a lot of people.
It does move a lot of people.
Which other folks who don't use it probably haven't got a clue.
It's a major highway.
It is. We even plow it, by the way.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but in our area, we're trying to get others to plow it where they are.
Up in this area, I just want to make a comment in that one thing I have learned in my relatively short tenure of being an elected person doing this transportation stuff is that we all have to appreciate and understand the challenges each jurisdiction has. Clearly, Manassas has different challenges than what Arlington has. But if I don't appreciate the fact that they are working on the trails and they are getting cars off the road so that the people in the outer jurisdictions who don't have as many multimodal options can get through, then we aren't going to move people around this region. So that's why I've always loved this, and working with COG and TPD, because that is how we're going to help all of our jurisdictions be able to move around. I'm sure people in Alexandria just don't stay in Alexandria. People in Manassas don't just stay in Manassas. So it's important, like you said, that we consider all of those things when we're doing our rating.
And thank you for that point, because I know in our current transaction, we did an origin destination graphic showing where the trips were originated and where they were going. It was very, very interesting information. You see a big circle with lines going across everywhere, really, and then really depicting the patterns, the commuting patterns for people in this region.
Yeah.
Were there any other?
Can I ask a couple questions?
Absolutely,
Process,
yeah.
So if Unit K full is going to talk about performance measures tomorrow, do you expect the things that are on page 9 to stay put?
No action tomorrow,
Just discuss.
just
So
discussion.
we're figuring out how to allocate and discuss the one next. I know you guys moved Kevin, I tried to pick a meeting day to work all the needs, but I'm afraid I might get a town next week. So can those of us who would like to participate remotely vote online or something?
For the next
Yeah,
PCAC
for
meeting,
the December 1st.
as long as we have a physical quorum present, you can participate and vote via electronically.
Okay.
Physical quorum is 5 for this.
Yeah, I think it might not include me next time, but we have plenty of folks here. So.
So I'm gonna check online and make sure there's no questions.
That's all right.
Yeah.
I think every meeting has been a different group here.
Yeah.
So
I tried.
it works hard for some.
Yeah.
We're good to go? Okay, so if there are no further questions, thank you very much for the presentation, Mr. Jasper. And I'm gonna turn the floor over to Ms. Backman.
Well, I just gave my update. The authority's having a work session. We're having a work session with the authority tomorrow on performance measures. And really the reason of doing that is because while we have the committee meetings and the planning and programming committee is a 5-member committee of the authority, it's a 5-member committee. So I want the full authority to have the opportunity to see this and have discussions before we ask them to vote next month. And that's all I have next year.
Okay, any questions, comments, or concerns? Awesome. So is there a motion to adjourn? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, thank you all so much. We'll see you next month.
Well done. It's always interesting.
Yeah.
Glad that they left their door.
Yeah.
No, I just got a letter.